questioning is perhaps the greatest gift we have as human beings.
Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking.
It's a way of thinking that teaches us to question everything we think we know.
Science came about by developing techniques, methodologies for gaining reliable knowledge about the world.
We have at our fingertips the technologies that were only possible for the largest governments and corporations 20 years ago as an individual today.
If human civilization continued at anything remotely like the current pace of technology advancement for 1 million years, where would we be? I think we're either extinct or on a lot of planets.
The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it.
We hold the scientific method in high regard because it works. If it stopped working, we'd throw it out.
Discover the past.
Create the future.
This is the Here and How podcast.
Welcome to the Here and How podcast, where every week we dive deep into big ideas to explore the past and create a brighter future. This is episode 1. Who created science? I'm Stephen Woodford, also known as Rationality Rules, and with me is the tremendous Thomas Westbrook, also known as Holy Kool-Aid, and the radiant Rachel Oates. Say hi, guys.
Aw, hi.
Hello.
Awesome introductions, eh? So, we've collectively decided that since this podcast is essentially a celebration of science, it's only right that the first episode is dedicated to the very foundation of science. And so, let's kick this off with a question that I'm going to give to both of you. Rachel, Thomas, what is science?
Ooh. It's a method for discovering stuff and learning stuff, and there's like a set of rules, and so I'd say science is definitely the method, but usually it comes up with answers that are pretty objective and can't really be changed. How's that?
That's good. What about you, Thomas? Would you add anything to that or change it?
It's a conspiracy by the government in order to trick us into believing things that aren't in our best interests. It's a power play.
Can I change my definition now?
Yeah, you can change the definition straight to that. You know, it's a really interesting question, you know, and so many people view science in a different way, you know. So if you ask who created science, you're going to be going back to... Well, immediately you go to the definition. So if science is the application of knowledge, then the first person who created fire, and probably even beyond that, you know, the first person to realize if you manipulate soil, you've got a better chance of having a good harvest, that counts as science. Whereas that doesn't really encapsulate the methodology, if you know what I mean. Because it's a slippery slope, because if you define science so loosely, then everything's science, and because everything's science, nothing is science. So it's quite difficult to really nail it down, and that really has to be the first thing that's done before you can really understand how to apply it and how to create your own formulas.
I think a big... Oh, sorry. Trying to...
Go ahead.
All right, thank you. I was going to say, I think a big problem is that in schools, when we're taught science, it's just kind of like remembering facts and learning facts. So it's easy to think of science as this thing that you learn, whereas it's not. It's a thing you do. It's a method, a set of rules. It's a way of uncovering information, testing ideas, you know? It's not this black and white thing that's always the same.
No, that's fantastically put. It really is a methodology. I think in our intro we have Alice Roberts saying that it's a way of thinking. And you're completely right. Lots of situations in schools, we're taught facts, you know, like this is how photosynthesis works, etc. And you answer according to what you've been taught. But you leave school, or a lot of people leave school, not really being taught what the value of science, you know, the methodology that was used to acquire that knowledge, you know, why do we actually know that? Incredibly important stuff. And it seems that in this day and age, a lot of people, even people who are interested in science, don't really have a grip and understanding of what it is, let alone why it matters. So if we was to ask who created science, what names come to your minds? And there can be several, but just who comes to your mind? Okay, so you got.
Sorry, my mind goes blank.
I would have to say most people, when they hear that question, they think of, you know, who added to our understanding of how the world works. Like, who are the most famous scientists? We think of, Newton and Galileo and Einstein, but we don't necessarily think of who contributed to our understanding of the methodology. People like Rene Descartes, who, brought up an understanding of, Cartesian doubt and questioning our own presuppositions. We don't necessarily think about people like Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things and was basically just trying to kind of dissect the world and our understanding of, like, this is like that because of this. So, let's logically reason this, and, like, trying to kind of understand it and figure out that the world is all made of, like, small parts and atoms, and we can kind of start from there and work our way up.
Yeah, you're bang on the money, really, because it's not a question that I had really thought of myself either, because it is like you expect, who are the biggest contributors, and Albert Einstein, as you were saying, and all of the big names, and we can really say what they brought to the table in many cases, or at least the facts that they discovered, etc. But knowing what the scientific method is, let alone who created it and who's responsible for it being formed in the way that it is not a question that many people ask. It may not be a question that many scientists ask, and it may be a question that a lot of people don't really see a lot of value in.
Yeah, it is actually quite interesting that we put so much emphasis on the people who've been using the scientific method, but not the people who came up with it in the first place. Like, we can sit here and we can name people like Mendel, who came up with, like, the whole genetics thing, and Darwin, who came up with evolution. We can name these off the top of our heads, but who came up with the idea of double-blind testing?
Exactly. That's
a great question. Off the top of my head, no idea. But that is so important to experiments today,
Yep, exactly. And who was the first person to, create a meta-study?
Yeah.
Or how long did it take until we actually had a breakdown of studies? Philosophy is like a term that's used for everything. It certainly was in the past. And basically you get branches of science that come out of it. So once we have a decent philosophical understanding of a certain thing, say life, all of a sudden biology arises from it, and then it's a science. And the scientific methodology is applied to it like it wasn't in the realm of philosophy. But these are all really interesting questions. And it seems that if we really want to know who created science, the first thing to do is to look at the history of science, and particularly the history of the scientific method. And very quickly we realize that there's not really one person, which is probably not surprising, right?
Well, I think there's a kind of a clarification too, that, like, most of us were taught in school the scientific method when it comes to, you make a hypothesis, and then you perform some type of experiment, you observe the results of that experiment, and then you either refine your hypothesis, or you continue testing and trying to disprove it, and it becomes an actual scientific theory. But a lot of times we don't necessarily, we're not taught in school, depending on the field. If you're in engineering or medicine or something, you might be, but if you're just in high school or you're in liberal arts, you're not really told what peer review is, what the value of peer review is, or what a double-blind clinical trial is, or a placebo, or, and some of it is we hear about all the time in the news, but there's so many different elements to trying to overcome our biases. All of us are going into trying to figure out how the world works with certain cognitive biases and self-delusions, and things seem intuitive. They seem like they are a particular way, and then it turns out that reality is actually completely counterintuitive to that, and finding the tools in order to come to a reliable understanding. Those tool sets we don't necessarily learn about. We don't necessarily know not just where they come from, but what they are. And I'm looking forward to uncracking, some of those and their history with you guys today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you were touching on the placebo there, like the placebo trial. We understand that if something's went through placebo trial, it's more likely that that's true. And placebo in short is that if you're given a sugar pill and you're told that you're going to, recover, people will recover, and it's not the pill that does it. It's just the change in mentality, etc. But as you were saying about the date of it,
if it's like psychosomatic,
yes,
they're not going to regrow a limb by taking a sugar pill, or it's not going to cure cancer.
Of course. Yeah, I should of course preface that that's the point of the placebo trial. You can test it against certain things, and that's why psychology is a big factor there. You know, taking a sugar pill or any pill to grow back a limb, that's some serious science to celebrate. But the placebo trial, the first controlled placebo trial, wasn't until 1936. Now, when I first learned that blew my mind. It's like a cornerstone of modern science. You know, that's absolutely crazy. Of course, it's not the methodology itself, but it's an incredible fact in and of itself.
Well, and you think about just like 100 years before that, doctors were bloodletting, and they were using bleaches, and I'm sure there's parts of the world where they still do.
Yeah, and if you look at today, homeopathy.
Yeah, and this stuff, like, it's not just, those idiots, like, this is kind of some laughable, crazy thing that they're doing. Like, people are dying. Like, people literally died because they're already sick and they need their blood to recover, and they're getting, their blood sucked out of them because of this backwards idea that it's bad blood that needs to be let out. Yeah. But it's science that's helped us to understand what does and doesn't work, and to reliably test it.
And particularly the testing of it, and being able to, do split tests and placebo trials, etc., on certain things, to just know if there is something in a certain methodology or a certain hypothesis that's given. So Homo sapiens evolved around 200,000 years ago, and we don't know much about them, but depending on how you define science, we can assume that they did scientific things. They surely would have passed information to one another over generations, how to hunt, how to gather food, etc., how to woo your fellow cave women. I'm sure things like that would have happened. But here's a question for you. You may know. When do you think the first symbols and markings on walls are dated to?
Ooh.
35,000 BC.
35,000 BC, okay. And what about you, Rachel?
Oh, God. 36,000 BC.
I was thinking...
Why do I go
first? Yes, exactly. Well, I'd like to say that your guess there, Rachel, is so much more correct than Thomas's. No, it's 40,000 years ago. Yeah, no, Wait, 40. So you're 40? Really not far off. Yeah. Okay. But the reason that the marking on walls is significant is because it's not just imagery. Imagery and art in general is a form of communication, even if it's just to express an emotion rather than information. It's still something, and it just shows that we really haven't been around for long on this planet, let alone had a scientific understanding of anything for very long at all. And it just contemplating these kind of facts is quite crazy. And then when you put that hand in hand with the fact that the placebo trial, first controlled placebo trial, didn't occur until 1937, it's just bizarre to look at it in that way.
So one interesting thing about that, you mentioned that the cave drawings were kind of a method of communication. And I was reading this article on one of the caves that, it's I forget which one it is, but it's in France, and it has like all these drawings and stuff, and it's very artistic, and you think, oh, they're passing down, or it's graffiti or something, they're telling stories. But then when they analyzed the sound structure of the caves, they found that the specific regions where all of these drawings were the ones that had the best acoustics. And so there's kind of a theory going around that, at least in this area, it was used almost as a form of theater, where, the light's shining on the wall at a particular angle, or they're using torches, and then the acoustics are like vibrating, and they're like telling a story about something. And it's almost like the earliest form of theater. So it's interesting how, theatrics and sharing information and telling stories, and that's so integral to the human experience, but that kind of has allowed us to pass on information to progress scientifically.
It's so fascinating. Yeah, I didn't know that. It's absolutely brilliant. There's so much we just can't know because there's just not the evidence to really have a grip on it. So it is awesome to hear little stories like that. It's, and the evidence does fit that hypothesis. That's a really interesting thing to consider. Because if you go back 100,000 years ago and you take a human from there and you was to bring them to our civilization now and bring them up with the same education, evidently they would have just as much opportunity, just as much capacity to know as much as me and you. Me and you both. So it's crazy to think that they are, despite them being our ancestors, with it just being 40,000 years ago, they are really just the same as us. And that they would have enjoyed expressing themselves through art, be that theatre, etc. It's fascinating stuff. But here's another question for you. When did agriculture start?
Oh.
I'll let Rachel go first this time.
Wise man.
It would have been before then, right? Before the pictures on the walls, I'm guessing. Maybe.
Sure. Okay.
I'm going to go with 80,000 years ago.
Yep, okay. And this is where you're going to say 79,000 years ago?
No, well, I'm thinking that it's much more recent because I think that the cave drawings were during like hunter-gatherer times, and that agriculture didn't come about until about maybe 12,000 years ago. But I'm going to be a dick and say 79,000.
Brilliant.
That does make more sense.
The way you answered that, to be honest, Rachel, made me think, you know what? It really does depend on how you define agriculture, because any kind of manipulation of crops could count as it. But evidently it's 9,000 years ago in southern Mexico.
Oh, okay.
Now, I think that's a really important point in time, because in order to really understand, that plants need nutrients and that they need water and that you can have a much greater harvest if you do X, Y, and Z, that really is, even though it might not have been known and it might have been applied in the wrong way, that is really starting to tackle the roots of the scientific method. At least from my perspective. I assume you'd agree with me, but it seems like that's definitely something going on there.
Well, and even if you have a false idea of what causes something, at least you're searching for cause and effect. So even if they don't at that point understand that correlation doesn't equal causation, and that just because two things are correlated doesn't mean that one caused the other, they're still entertaining a particular thought pattern where they're like, oh, hey, this happens and then we get these crops, so let's do more of this, so let's try that, and let's see if it works. It didn't work this time, maybe we'll try something else. And so, kind of eliminating, figuring out that, hey, water is good to throw on plants because they tend to grow after you water them. Now, they might think that by sacrificing virgins to some type of, god, that it increases the amount of rain. But there's still, in a way, it's like, because science hadn't come along yet, then religion was the early steps to get them there too.
Yeah, I think you touched on such an important point there, and you put it so well, and that is that we evolve to see, for cause and effect. We see patterns when they're not necessarily there. So it might be that the thing that's hindered us and still is hindering us in many areas, where we're seeing patterns where they're not here, where they're not there, so it is really responsible for religion and for superstition in general. It might be that very mentality that gives us those negatives that also has given us the positives of science, because we wanted to understand the nature of things. We wanted to understand the cause and effect. I wouldn't say that that's the scientific method per se, but it definitely is the fertile foundation of it, as it were. So yeah, you're right. Like, they would have been. It does matter that they were sacrificing people rather than realizing how it just needs water. But it may, in some sense, be able to be seen as a necessary step.
Yeah. At least it was like the first step in them looking for correlations.
So would it be accurate to say virgin's blood was the earliest fertilizer?
It was the earliest fertilizer that didn't work. But
I don't know. I'm sure that when people, degrade into the soil. That
actually,
there's some nutrients that.
No, you're right. That actually would work because we know that
probably not enough
with...
for a whole field, but
I think it depends where you sacrifice the virgin. Like if you're doing it on top of some hill, probably not.
Yeah.
If you're doing it right there in the field, maybe.
Well, it depends on the size of the virgin.
That is true as well. Yeah. Do you reckon we could get like a paper published, like the most efficient way to sacrifice a virgin for the best crops?
Well, we could, but I doubt we're going to get it past an ethics board.
Damn peer review.
Yes, exactly. Peer review. If you've done it just before the peer review. Yeah. Oh man, we're
not even going to get it to the peer review stages. The ethics board's going to shoot it down before we even perform the study.
We'll have to go to another country to publish.
All this red tape is just always pushing science back a few thousand years. Ugh.
I hear that there's some real room for scientific growth in Somalia.
Go ahead, be my guest.
I apologize to our one Somalian listener.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Well, I'll bring us back on track. That's brilliant. But that is the new business plan that we're going to progress, I assure you. During the same time, like 9,000 years ago, that's where the first observations of astronomy seem to be coming in. But it's more astrology because all of the observations were always teleological. They always assume that the celestial bodies have something to do with us. Like you've got modern day astrology, and it's kind of the same. It's just like why is the moon moving like that? What is it trying to tell us? How does it influence us? So while they're trying to understand the cause and effect, they're again making a mistake, and it reminds me of it's a failed science in that sense, because it is trying to understand, or they were trying to understand. It's just they were injecting presuppositions and premises that they had no reason to do so. And of course, astronomy, which came a lot longer down the line, basically took astrology, removed the assumptions, which is basically working with the scientific method, and then just asked the questions as and when they were justified to ask them, which is very cool.
A lot of these problems that you're bringing up are probably things that were that we kind of like evolved to have to help us in some other way. So looking for patterns where there aren't any, and supposing that everything is centered around us, they're the things that would at one point have kept us safe. Like if we see a lion, we immediately see teeth and think, oh, teeth mean danger. That's a pattern. Or we see a lion and think, oh, it's going to attack me. It keeps you safe, and the lion might not even have noticed you, but just assuming it has and assuming it's going to attack you, so you get out of there, is those sort of things that keep people safe in the long term. And so they've just kind of passed over into other areas of our thought processes and our lives, and it can hinder some things, but once upon a time it helped us.
Yeah, exactly. So the person that thought, oh, there's going to be a lion there, and there isn't, is going to have a higher chance of surviving and reproducing and propagating his genes than the person that's rational and goes, it's likely that it's wind. And so when we look at us now and we see that we're, pattern seeking, power seeking primates, it's no surprise. We evolved this way. Nature selected for us to be irrational, to see patterns when they're not there. And science is kind of like the fight against that. It's the desire to find objectivity.
Well, I think more than just the fight against that, it's the fight to find the actual signal in the noise. Because, one of the largest medical studies ever conducted basically determined the link between cigarettes and lung cancer and heart disease. And it was... I'm pulling these numbers out of kind of a distant memory, but I want to say it was tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. It might have been 10,000, might have been 100,000, but it was a huge study over the course of years. And they tried to take that data and be like, well, what could be causing this? You find all these correlations, but then you try to isolate different factors and figure out, what is the link here? What is causing this? When we factor out everything else, is there still a strong trend between, these two things? And, and they found an extremely strong link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer and heart disease. And so, I mean, it's not that we're just trying to fight against patterns or that we're trying to fight against, correlations. It's that we're trying to figure out what the actual cause is and to get rid of all the excess noise.
Yeah, you make me think of like the scientific language to describe the results of that amazing study, amazing enterprise that and the progress we've made with realizing that cigarettes cause cancer. Colloquially, normal, informal language, we would say science has proven that cigarettes cause cancer. But scientifically, that's not the language that's used. You don't use proof in that way. You would say there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that supports this theory. And it's amazing how people that are scientifically illiterate can take something that's stated in a scientific way, which is actually saying it's damn well true. Take, for example, the theory of evolution. It's true. They can see this and go, well, it's just a theory, and it's just, I think that really kind of like it capsulizes why it's important to understand the scientific method, not only because of the language it uses, but because of the delicacy it has when treading around subjects. It kind of rejects the idea of absolute truth, and it basically says we can only really know things to a certain degree, and that's fine. Because, and they've learnt their lesson. Newton brought out his laws on gravitation. Then Einstein supersedes it, and it's called Einstein's theory of general relativity. To a large extent, though not entirely. That's because they kind of realised the mistake. You can't call it that, because while it's absolutely correct, like Newton's laws are still correct when you're trying to evaluate trajectory and gravity, etc. on Earth. It just doesn't work when it's applied to the celestial bodies. And Einstein's works here and on the celestial bodies, but it breaks down when it comes to the Big Bang and black holes. And this is good that we call it a theory, because there may be something that actually explains further on, a quantum perspective. And science would have done the right approach by saying it's a theory, and although it was absolutely awesome and it could predict and still can predict amazing things, we realized and we knew, because of the methodology, because of the approach, that it's not necessarily the answer entirely.
This actually reminds... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, thanks. I was going to say, this reminds me of, there's actually a website out there where they take loads and loads of data from loads and loads of different studies and things like that, and you can basically just like kind of plug it in, and it shows you where there's random correlations between data. So it could be like the number of red cars driving down one particular street, and the number of people in a completely different country who die of a heart attack. And it might show you that there's, a really, really strong correlation between them.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of proving the point that by just looking at little patterns like that, you could assume that, the more red cars drive down this one street, the more people die of a heart attack in India,
Yep.
Whereas having the scientific method and having those set of rules and being able to repeat it and try different things and having hypotheses that are falsifiable and all these different things, having rules for how you test these things, it kind of sorts out the coincidences and the correlations from the actual facts and the causations. And I know what you were saying just reminded me of that.
No, actually, what you were just saying is correlation does not equals causation.
Yeah.
And one of the examples that the giant spaghetti monster religion uses is that as pirate populations have went down, CO2 emissions have went up, or the temperatures went up. Therefore, if we want to fight against climate change, we must promote more people being pirates. And it does really get down to the essence of the scientific method. It says, no, it's not enough to just see a correlation. You need to be able to make accurate predictions and to demonstrate it under peer review. Now, peer review actually hasn't been around for a long time. I believe, I can look up on my notes. In fact, I'll ask you while I have a quick look. When do you think peer review was first basically a thing?
The 1700s.
Yeah, well, close. Did you manage to see it before me?
No. Yes.
Yeah, well, no, 1675.
I want to say that even back as far as like the ancient Greeks, there were, you would have like a teacher and a student, and oftentimes the student would have particular, works, bodies of work that they would put past their teacher or put past their mentor for some form of review. And it's not quite the same as what we have today, where you have an unbiased third party, that's basically policing what goes into a well-respected medical journal, but that's subscription based. But at the same time, it is in a way, expert analysis, which is similar to the purpose of peer review.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, to be fair. I see, when I think of peer review, I think of peers review. But you're right, the peer review could be one, rather than the system that we understand it today. Talking off the first people that had peers, as it were, or just before getting to them, I know that you're both aware of this, but a fantastic book dated to 1600 BC, and this may be the earliest real recording of the scientific method, was called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and of course Egyptian. But basically what he did was he looked at medicine, and he looked at how examination, diagnosis, treatment and prognosis to injuries exactly work, and he described it really quite accurately. And that kind of is, in a nutshell, at least from a medical sense, what it's about. There's no assumptions being made. You examine it, you see, exactly what's happening. Then you're able to diagnose it, and once you've diagnosed it and you've had other versions of what you're seeing, that's when you can start applying treatment, where you may be doing cause and causation fallacies, etc., but you're still using the method. And it does seem to be that if you want the earliest date, it seems to be the Edwin Smith Papyrus, 1600 BC. And I should just point out to the listeners that the information that we're given here is a accumulation from many different places with decent resources, which we'll be sure to link on the YouTube description and wherever we post it, as long as it allows us with room. But if you're very interested in the history and you want a timeline of it, it's absolutely worth looking on the Wikipedia entry, which is really, really good. You just type in the scientific method timeline, and it will give you just wonderful information. It's a good read, and to a large extent, that's where we're going to be pulling a lot of the information from. Just thought I'd put that out there for anyone that's interested. Yeah, but when we go to the first single people, so we've got Thales. Okay, Thales is dated to 624 to 548 BC. Thales of Miletus, and he really is one of my heroes ever since searching him up. And I know that we've discussed him before, but it's absolutely worth, to anyone that hasn't heard of him, he's worth knowing about.
He's your little man crush, isn't he?
I tell you what, I genuinely, I don't have children, I genuinely want to name a child after him. I just once in a while I find someone and I'm just blown away by them, and Thales is the most recent. The biggest ever was Darwin, or the intellectual man crushes.
You're going to have a son named Darwin Thales Woodford.
Exactly. It wouldn't work for a female. Problem with Thales, you could be called Fail. That's the short of it, so it doesn't quite work. But Thales is very important because he hypothesized that nature follows inherent laws that can be understood. And he seems to be the first to have ever done that. Before then, everybody assumed that the reasons are existential. It's because of gods. Or magic, etc. So you were saying about sacrificing people, and there's witches involved with the crops and stuff. Thales seems to be the first person who really expressed that no, nature just follows inherent laws, and if we understand them, we can basically become master of it. And so with that, he was the first person to really put doubt on superstition and religion, and to a large extent, that's why he's one of my heroes. I think he really does embody the don't make an assumption, just go in there and verify what's there and then build a model on that. And that really is the scientific method.
I definitely agree. I think this was one of the biggest game changers, because instead of people just saying, oh, the gods did it, or just assuming there was nothing they could do, he was like that first person who said everything has a natural cause, and he was the one who was looking for it, and he never just accepted anything, and that's kind of like the big game changer. Because if we lived in a world where we just thought, oh, God does this and a God does that, or these things just happen and we have no control over it, can you imagine how far behind we'd be compared to where we are now?
Yeah, and you can kind of see that relic in people that you know. So I'm sure you guys know people, and they will say things like everything happens for a reason, and some people just mean that in a deterministic sense, but a lot of people do genuinely mean that. So you can see why that mentality would have been extremely prevalent back then. But it is very hard for like people who appreciate science and live in this wonderful age that we do. We're very fortunate. It's very easy for us to mistake the mentality that people have had over the centuries and how they approached life and what they thought was real, etc. It's really quite crazy. But
I wonder how, because you said that this is the earliest recorded instance of someone thinking in this particular way, or this particular fashion. But I wonder how common it was at the time, because, obviously we don't have a ton of writings that go back this early that are on, topics like this. And, so what we might get, something that's, like the Code of Hammurabi, or we might have like epic tales of some hero or something. But I wonder if he faced any negative feedback. I wonder if he faced any kind of repercussions for publishing something like this.
Sorry.
Do you know if we have any records of?
We do,
outcome,
and I'm so excited that I have to interrupt you. So we do have decent records on him, but as with anyone, anything that dates to people and antiquity, it's not ironclad, as it were. But the reason why he was able to even have these thoughts and to publish them is because he lived in Ionia, and Ionia had basically just been ruined, and his civilization that he came from had just been like overtaken by war. And so Ionia was a very fresh new place which invited people and allowed multiculturalism, and a lot of places didn't. The Egyptians didn't. You can't go out of these barriers. Religion has been very prevalent, and when it gets control, it gets control. It silences others. You just need to look at a single page of history to see it. But Ionia was brilliant, and it was fertile because it didn't have an overarching presence like that. You had people from Babylonian, which and you also had the Greeks, and they just had different competing theories, and they wanted to test them and try them out. But what's dated is that he was able to accurately predict well in advance a solar eclipse, and he was also able to predict a particularly great harvest, and he used that knowledge to buy out all of the olive presses in Miletus and then rent them out at the peak of the season in order to make himself rich. So this now, ultimately, we don't know if these stories are true. I suspect they probably are. There's some decent coverage on it. But
at least whoever wrote it down realized the efficacy of science.
That it's kind of like when it comes to Socrates as well. It doesn't actually matter. What matters is that at that time and age, this mentality, the hypothesis that nature actually follows inherent laws, it manifested then. So it doesn't matter if Thales, even if he didn't exist, let alone do what he did. Same with Socrates. What matters is that mentality was born in Miletus, and it is went to Athens, and it's basically the bedrock of Greek civilization, ancient Greek civilization, and out of Greek civilization is basically everything we kind of value. And you've got whatever's built on top of it kind of tries to steal those bedrocks. Christianity tries. You can see with Ben Shapiro doing it recently, trying to say that it's Christianity is the bedrock of Western civilization. It's not. It's the Greeks, and it's because of people like Thales, whether or not he existed. So as far as if somebody created science, which I to be fair, I reject, I would say that Thales is the man to put it on. But it does remind me of an analogy that you've used before, if you wouldn't mind expressing again, Thomas, about it's not that we stand on giants. I remember you mentioned that before.
It's not. Which analogy specifically?
Yeah, so before in a conversation, I've said to you that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we need to recognise these people. And you made a wonderful point, which is relevant to what I just said, and that is, well no, it's not that you stand on someone's shoulder. You're standing on lots of people's shoulder. It's wrong to embody it in one person.
Exactly. It's more like a chain of people, and you're standing on someone's shoulders, who's on someone else's, who's on someone else's, who's on someone else's, and it goes all the way down. Mm-hmm. And we're the beneficiaries of that. But I really think that this point is key, that even if Thales didn't exist at all, these values that you're mentioning, they still hold true. This is the kind of the bedrock of what we're building upon. And this is kind of what sets science apart from religion, and why when people will say, sometimes I'll get the accusation that like, oh, this, you're just a believer in scientism and it's a religion and stuff. And I'm like, even if the people who I respect and admire, who put forth particular ideas in science, even if we find out tomorrow that this person is as fake as King Arthur or Robin Hood, or maybe they exist, maybe they didn't, maybe it's a legend, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. The works of Thales or Plato or Aristotle or any philosopher or any scientist who's ever lived, they stand on their own merits. They stand regardless of the author. They don't need any kind of divine inspiration. They don't need any kind of, amazing hero to present them. The merits stand just on the basis that they're true and that they increase our knowledge. They increase our understanding. To quote Dawkins, science, it works, bitches. It's, and I think that people they started to understand that, going all the way back to Thales, that we can actually use this stuff and it has ramifications on the world, that like it works. It's not just speculation.
I think that's really important, actually. He was one of the first people who kind of made studying and understanding science useful. He bought up olive groves so he could make money. He started to be able to like predict earthquakes and understand what earthquakes were, which meant he probably saved a lot of lives. Because of him, people started to see the practical applications of trying to make sense of the world around us, whether it was to make money or to plan things or save people's lives or whatever it was.
Yeah, just to put an extra point on what you were saying there about the earthquakes, and it's a wonderful example. He thought that all land floats on water because there are some islands that do float on water, and so he hypothesized that that's true of all land. And he thought that earthquakes were caused by big waves crashing into the floating land and causing movement. Now, he's wrong. We know he's wrong, but I think it's Sagan, I believe, who said it does not matter that he was wrong. What matters is his approach. It's falsifiable. It's so far ahead of everything that really seems to have come before him, or at least that we have access to, save the Egyptian papyrus, the Edwin papyrus. It's just that really, it's why he's one of my newest heroes. It's just a fantastic, and it doesn't matter if he exists, as you were just saying.
He took that. Sorry.
Well, that's one area that, whenever somebody tells me, they're like, oh, you think you know it all, or you science people, you think that science can answer everything, but you don't know everything yet. And it's like, no, but science knows that it doesn't know everything. Yeah. And that's why it hasn't stopped. That's why it's still going. That's why we're not living in the Dark Ages. That's why we're able to launch rockets into space and land probes on comets, because science is constantly moving forward. It's constantly learning more. It's constantly improving its tools and improving its methods and its models. So yeah, this guy's wrong about, land, just all the continents floating on water, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that he was utilizing a method. He was adding to our way of thinking to try to understand, and it's falsifiable. And when we prove something wrong, science isn't set back; it's set forward. If I come along right now and I disprove that Jesus never existed or Muhammad never existed, Christianity and Islam would be decimated. Yeah. That would be the end of it. You prove that one thing wrong, and their whole religion is out. Whereas with science, you could prove that this guy didn't exist at all.
Exactly.
And yet the ideas that were put forth in his name are still valid. They still apply to the world around us.
Yeah, the value of Jesus requires that the story's true, that he did exist.
No, that's not to say that there aren't certain morals or something that
True.
you can scrape from these religions, but the religion itself would be proven wrong were that the case. And then, from there, it's like you basically have to kind of pick and choose and use science to figure out which one of these moral teachings really suit our society best and are best for the well-being of everyone in our society. So it's this way of thinking that I think is so crucial. Yeah, science has gotten some stuff wrong, but it's science that finds out that it got it wrong in the first place and corrects it.
Yeah. And it rewards it. It gives out rewards. It says, well done, you've disproven this theory. We're in great debt to you. Here's a reward,
Here's a Nobel Prize. Go spend your $1 million on it.
Yeah, I mean, we want this.
There's actually a really, interesting little line that Ken Ham constantly says to people and writes about. And he says something like, who would you rather trust? Scientists who know that they don't know everything and who can be proven wrong, or God, who knows everything and will never be proven wrong? And I know the answer he wants us to say, but I'm like, scientists! It's scientists! It's
anybody that tells you that they have absolute knowledge is a liar or a fool.
Exactly.
It's just, with maybe the exception of I think, therefore I am.
Have any of you guys seen that video where I think it was the pastor, was it Kenneth Copeland or one of the ones it was Ted Haggard up in Colorado, and he's talking to Dawkins, and he's like, you scientists are so arrogant and so proud, and you think you know it all. And I was just sitting there shaking my head. I'm thinking
that's the opposite.
It's so much the opposite, because every scientist I've ever encountered, if there's a particular field that's their expertise and someone's telling them something that's absolute hogwash and knows nothing about it, they might kind of smirk at them or laugh at them because they think that they're an idiot. Mm-hmm. But over and over and over again, I'll see people in the scientific community who, they're presenting some new thing or they're trying to disprove something, and they're extremely humble about it in the sense that they understand, we don't know everything yet. We're trying to figure stuff out. Here's our gaps in our understanding. But here's what we do know so far. Here's the pieces of the puzzle that we have together. Here's what the picture looks like, even with a few missing pieces. Mm-hmm. But we understand we don't know all of it, and we're working on it. Whereas the opposite approach is to say, we know everything that there is to know, and exactly what you were saying that Ken Ham said. It's just, that's an extremely arrogant approach. And it's the death knell in curiosity.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. It kills it. Yeah, it's a good point. It just burns it then and there.
The thing I love about science and the scientific method is that even wrong answers get us further. We might do a study looking at does some drug cure some illness, and even if the outcome is no, we're still one step closer to curing, because now we just know what not to try. Do you know what I mean?
So,
yeah,
no, it's a great point. It's some critics of science will say, well, you say that you're open to new approaches and being proven wrong, but anyone that tries to prove that autism is linked to vaccines, you laugh them off immediately, and it kind of misses a context that they're not really appreciating, and that is that this has been tested. Yeah. It's been tested via peer review. Mm-hmm. It's been tested in a multitude of ways, and it's just at the point where it's a waste of money to try and find a connection between the two, and that's why it's laughed at.
Same with flat Earth. There's so much evidence there that the Earth is round. Why would we want to waste more money looking to see whether it's flat?
Yeah, it is. It's just, and we'll definitely create a video on the flat Earth in the future. Yes, it's a fascinating subject. But yeah, it does seem that science and scientists at times laugh off other ideas, and almost in a hubris, arrogant way. And to somebody that doesn't understand the scientific method and doesn't understand science in general, I can see why they would look at that and go, whoa, the entire enterprise of science is just dismissing even testing this concept, when it's because they don't realize that it has been tested, or that one individual doesn't represent an entire body or mode of thinking. It's just not the way it works.
I was at a conference last year, and I was talking to Lawrence Krauss about this, and he basically was saying that he's like, almost every single week I have some new crackpot who sends me an email that says, Einstein was wrong about ... or, you know, I figured out how to create cold fusion or something like that. And it's always like some amateur scientist who has, you know, not dedicated their entire life to the particular field where suddenly they have this amazing breakthrough. And they usually haven't thought through all the different stuff that, you know, you learn about in your undergraduate degree, you learn about in your graduate degree. You test and you recreate experiments and you try stuff, and then you get, you know, your PhD and your postdoc. And so, like, for someone who is so well versed in science to suddenly have someone come along and just like they have some new theory that they claim will overturn everything that we know about science up until this point, it's a little bit laughable, because we're at the point where, you know, we have thousands of scientists around the world who have been hammering away at these things for so long, and for someone to come along and be like, you know, the theory of evolution is wrong, for example. Obviously that's not Krauss's field, this is a different example, but if someone comes along and just throws that out there and they're like, you're so closed-minded you won't look at it, it's like, well, we have literally been testing this one theory in every single field of science, from geology to microbiology, to genetics, to anatomy and physiology, to every single field. And so we're able to take all of this information, and this one theory is held up by a network, a spider web of thousands of surrounding data points and pieces of evidence. And so for it to be wrong, you wouldn't just have to put forth a new theory that explains one thing. You would have to put forth a new theory that adequately explains every single one of the other data points. And even then, you would still only have two competing viable theories until you found something wrong with the theory of evolution that disproved it, that your new theory was able to account for. And so far, no one has been able to do that, which is why it's seen as fact within the scientific community, which is why it's backed up as a legitimate theory that explains so many different things.
I think that's a very excellent and important point, but I do think it's also kind of like important to mention that science isn't this like special field that only a few people have access to. Like, I think it's still important to know that like everyone can enjoy science and everyone can try and search for new things in science. They just need to have the right methods and the right basis for their knowledge. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not saying like, you know, there's no point in anyone just like... No, what I'm trying to say is like there's no point saying, oh, there's no point in anyone researching this field anymore because it's been completely proven. Like, if people do want to go out and research it, keep doing it, like, go for it. If people can prove it wrong, amazing. But you kind of... It's good to get an idea of where the boundaries are, if that makes sense.
No,
like,
it is, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I didn't explain that well.
No, it's fine.
No, I 100% agree with where you're coming from. And I think that we need more people in science, not less.
Yes.
And that the problems of the future and the problems of tomorrow are only going to be solved by, you know, more people diving into these fields, more people gaining access to scientific information. The internet is democratizing that. It's making it available to just about everyone. But just because you pull up something on Google and, you know, you think that, you know, you haven't studied any of the other topics, you haven't taken any courses in chemistry or physics or calculus or anything else, you're probably not going to solve some complex problem that all of the greatest minds in the world are testing right now at the, you know, super collider and the Large Hadron Collider in CERN. You know,
but you can, which is awesome.
Maybe.
It's very unlikely.
That you have.
But that's the beauty of science, you know. Like, it is not really argument from authority. So if you walk in, it doesn't... it's statistically very unlikely. Your point's absolutely correct. But somebody could walk in and they've just It could even be that they've spent a month looking at it and it's just intuitive to them. They could be the Mozart of quantum mechanics, etc. And he just walks in and goes, listen, here's a paper, help me publish it. Someone will help him publish it. And that guy's now known for what he is, because really what matters is, it's a bit like when you really want to discover something. It doesn't matter about who's arguing something. It matters about the content and the quality of the argument. And if that's given by somebody who's never had an education, but they've just got it right, the scientific committee will listen, and it will make that work with, or at least adopt it and take it seriously. But they won't take serious some guy just going, hey, I've just read up on evolution and I can't understand it and therefore it's false and God.
I think this actually circles back around to a really important point about the importance of peer review, because nowadays it's very, very easy for anyone with a computer to read a few self-published articles and put together a YouTube video and say, oh, I've completely disproven evolution because this, and this. And there's no peer review system there. There's no standards there. There's nothing to say their sources are real or reliable or accurate. And there's none of that, which is why reputable journals and the peer review process is so important nowadays. And I think a really big skill that a lot of people don't have is being able to recognize a legitimate source.
I think your the second point you just made there is absolutely the main thing that we need to install in future generations, and that is to educate them to understand how to look at things critically. Like, I think in schools, critical thinking should be a very important subject. And it's for that reason, because if we value democracy, we have to allow people to express whatever views they want. And with technology being what it is, they can make it look very professional, etc. You just need to look at the History Channel and look at pyramid documentaries, etc. But the way to fix it is not to ban that or to fight against it in any kind of jurisdiction way. It's to get people to be able to apply critical thinking themselves. And the first step of that is to teach them what critical thinking is. And if you do that, you've already taught them the scientific method.
Yeah.
Oh, can I add too, I don't want it to sound like I'm discouraging people from joining into science, because if anything, that's the whole purpose of this show.
Yeah.
We're trying to get people curious about science, to dive into it and to learn. And right now, we're living in an age where access to knowledge has never been easier. And while it's true that, that also means access to false knowledge and fake news and sites that are, spreading pseudoscience and alternative whack products and ideas, there's also people who are, for the first time ever, you have kids that are creating, amazing, robotic engineering projects that are, forming brand new companies off of it, that are, doing cancer research, high school kids. So I want people to get involved. I want people to realize that they can get involved with this stuff. But I want to also instill, because I hear so often, I'll hear people in pseudoscientific positions that will say something like, oh, here's, some weird, snake oil product that will cure this, and that. And it was put forth by some scientist that was shot down by the scientific community. But, Einstein was only a patent clerk. And I have to take a step back, because I'm like, okay, first of all, that's not true. Einstein actually had a PhD. A lot of people don't realize that. He was a professor. He taught at the University of Berlin. He got his PhD, I think, at the University of Zurich. And he was one of the greatest minds. He was not a high school dropout. He actually always excelled in math. That was a misconception about him. But even if he was only a patent clerk, there's still a body of knowledge that you have to acquire, an understanding that you have to acquire in certain fields in order to, if you're trying to push a field forward and you're 10,000 miles back and you're not even touching the body of knowledge, it's going to be very difficult for you to have the knowledge that you need to work with in order to make progress. That doesn't mean that your layperson can't obtain those facts and knowledge in order to make the progress. I think it's extremely doable. There's a lot of free college courses online at Coursera and edX and other places where they can learn this stuff, and anyone can learn it and soak it up. Khan Academy is an excellent resource. But I'm just saying, like, sometimes in order to learn certain new facts, or to put forth new theories, you have to have a certain base level of understanding. And when people just throw out ideas without actually diving in headfirst into a field, it is pretty unlikely that they're going to make massive discoveries that no one has made before. And when they start putting it forth as fact that's just being shot down by some conspiracy of the scientific community, then, you know, I start taking some issues with it, because the community's there to as a filter for bad ideas and bad science.
Like, if they're being shot down, there's generally a reason to it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people kind of skip over that.
Yeah, there's many great points you raised there that I absolutely agree with. I'm almost stuck for where to jump in on that. It really is important for us, as we've discussed before, that those listening, you know, if you're interested in science and, you know, you want to learn more, then just do it. There's a very negative culture kind of going around where you just don't do that and do your 9 to 5. Just, if you like science, pursue it. You could be the next person that contributes in a really significant way. And if I and us could in any way be part of that journey, just because we inspired you to take it more seriously, that would be phenomenal.
I think something that we've spoken about before that we haven't really mentioned today is this idea that often people look back at people like Einstein and Darwin and you know, even as far back as like the Greeks and Egyptians and stuff, and think that all these people who made these big discoveries must just be geniuses and be born with this like intelligence. And I just kind of want to emphasize again that that's not necessarily true at all. The amazing thing about having the scientific method is that anyone can apply it. Anyone can have an idea and test it, and people can come along and repeat those experiments and try them again. There's no, like, you know, threshold of you must have an IQ of this much to be a scientist. It's something that anyone can do and anyone can try. And if you have an idea and it's falsifiable, you can test it. And I think that's kind of amazing.
It is. To just like add on top of that, and a lot of people kind of see science as, you know, I've heard conspiracy theorists say, oh, you're being indoctrinated. The difference between indoctrination and science or scientific education is indoctrination is telling you what to believe. It's telling you what to say. And I will say that there are some situations where science isn't taught properly, and that is the way that it's taught, and that kind of is a form of indoctrination. I don't like that approach. But as we've been emphasizing here, science is a way of thinking, and it's giving people the tools to apply critical thinking, and that's not indoctrination. I mean, what people do with that's up to them, you know, how they apply that and what they figure out. The difference is night and day, and it's worth not allowing people to conflate it.
Yeah. For me, indoctrination is being told you're not allowed to question anything or not being allowed to question it at all. Whereas with science, you're constantly encouraged to ask how and why and look for patterns and connections and question everything you hear. If you hear something that doesn't sound right to you, that's okay. Ask why. Ask if you can see it repeated. Ask if you can see the evidence. And if it's good science, or if it's good information, it'll be backed up, you know?
Well, and it's, when I think of cults and cult-like manipulation tactics, they do use indoctrination. They tell people, don't ask questions, I'm in charge, I'm the leader, you know, this is the way that things are, you just have to do it on faith, or whatever tools they use to twist people's arms and get them to do whatever they want them to do, to capitulate. Science is the process of asking questions. Yeah. So for someone to say that science discourages questions, science is how you ask questions. It's telling you to ask questions. Just because there may be people in the scientific community, there may be scientists, there may be, you know, people doing research, or you know, somebody in some scientific journal, some editor or whoever that is closed-minded. Doesn't mean that they represent the scientific method. Doesn't mean that they represent the process of asking those questions.
For sure, yeah,
That's a really
for sure.
important point. I think like people have biases, but the scientific method on the whole doesn't, and I think that's a really important distinction to make. The idea of the scientific method is to try and remove as much bias as possible.
And the irony is, as somebody that walks in with a bias can be proven to have a bias by using the scientific method.
Yeah.
So you can show them that they're not playing their own game correctly. Yeah, but so as far as a person, as far as the question, who created science, it's either Thales or it's not really anybody. It's a collection.
Or it's you!
God. Is that a Family Guy sketch or it's just God being yelled at someone?
I think it was the Family Guy redneck version of the Cosmos.
That was it. That was fantastic. For sure. So if we was to power through all of the big contributions to the scientific method and how it was shaped, we would be here for ages, and it would be more like a lecture, and that's not what we want to give. It's not. We don't want to bore you, all of you listening, but if you are interested, there's some great resources out there, and we've put many links. We will put many links in the description
and on our website as well,
and on our website and wherever we can. But before we wrap up, as it were, I thought it'd be worth pointing out just a few things that surprised me in my research, and if you guys have anything to add, then we can note them out now as well, because they're interesting. One of them is that it wasn't until 320 BC, so 300 years after Thales, that Aristotle basically made up or conjured the fields of physics, poetry, zoology, logic, and rhetoric. So before then, as I was saying, it was just all philosophy. And also at that point, and this is just shows like the difference in thinking. It was the first time anyone really made the full assertion that their reality exists and there are truths to be known about reality. Whether or not we can obtain those truths, we don't know. But Aristotle very much made in his posterior analytics that point, that truth does exist, that facts and reality are real, despite our experience with it. And that's a very important step, which postmodernism and several people who are viewed as public intellectuals at the moment are trying to say is not the case. But that is a
just
topic
like
for another day.
Man.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, it depends on how you define truth. But here's another one for you. 200 BC, the first catalogued library at Alexandria. I'll get told off if I say that wrong. 200 BC, that's crazy. Imagine what it would have been like to...
Just going to throw this out there, but if you play the new Assassin's Creed Origin games, you can visit the library, and it's amazing.
Oh, I'm sold. It's a good game, and it's got something awesome there.
It's so good. It sounds stupid, but what surprised me is that it's all scrolls.
Yes.
Which is so weird, and it makes sense when you think about it, but in my head you think library, and you think, like, bound books, but obviously they didn't have those. Everything's on scrolls, and it's kind of amazing in the game. But yeah, it's just one of those things that kind of flips your expectations a bit.
Yeah, that is. I mean, that's where the term scrolling comes from, isn't it? Because you're scrolling through something. So if you say, I'm just scrolling through this webpage or scrolling through this book.
That's smart.
Unraveling a scroll.
Yeah. Again, one of you two might have taught me that a while back.
Yeah,
but,
I think we were talking about it, actually. But yeah, no, it makes sense.
Awesome. It would be worth mentioning just about the history of science that there was a particular couple of 100 years where Islam was really at the heart of it. And it was because, again, like a little bit like Ionia, they invited cultures and they didn't denigrate and imprison those that don't have certain beliefs. And they had a very successful, fruitful time during several hundred years, with I think it's Al-Hazin and his book of optics, etc. Unfortunately, that ended because a new religious leader came in and said math is of the devil, essentially, and so that ended then and there.
At the time of their boom, wasn't that the same time that Christianity was kind of spreading over Europe and their progress was kind of being stopped in its tracks?
Probably. I mean, I don't know my history well enough to know. Maybe you do, Thomas.
It's interesting because you look at that time period during the golden age of Islam, and it was a time period where science was valued, and where religion was took a bit of a back burner. So there's always kind of been this struggle between, you know, the supernatural, spiritual, divine versus how does the world actually work, the natural way of observing and using that usefully gathered data to create things and to build things and to understand reality. And so there was a group, I believe they were called the Mutazilites, that were very much more liberally minded. I think that they didn't see the Quran as like the eternal word of God. I encourage our listeners to go and research all the details on this, but it was around the fall, like as that mindset was kind of becoming prevalent, they were taking all of the ancient Greek philosophers' books, and a lot of them survived because they were translated into Arabic.
Yeah.
But they took some of the works of like Plato and Aristotle and others, translated them into Arabic. There was a huge surge in, you know, the word algebra comes from Arabic. I think there's a bunch of constellations or stars or something that are named after Arabic names and stuff. There was this huge growth.
Yeah, Arabic numerals, etc.
And then it took a devastating shift. Now, part of it was, I believe there was the Mongol invasion around that time, but there was also a huge religious ideological shift where that fell into disregard, and people began valuing a conservative, traditional, literalistic interpretation of the Quran and Islam. And that superseded this scientific liberal mindset. And they really haven't bounced back to any kind of major degree since then. Now, this isn't exclusive to Islam. We saw, you know, during the Middle Ages, there was a similar period where, you know, there was some preservation in monasteries of certain scientific works. But you look at some of the writings of, you know, Thomas Aquinas and Plutarch and even Martin Luther, and there's such a reverence for just taking things blindly on faith and not questioning, and a denigration of curiosity and thinking for yourself and questioning everything. Even, you know, doubting Thomas is seen as this evil, horrible person because he was using the scientific method. He was asking, show me the scars. I want to see it. I want to test it. I want to try it.
Yeah.
He's the one who's doing it right, but he's seen as, you know, oh, doubt is this horrible thing. How could he do such a thing? And I think that really did, if nothing else, it set back the mindset of the scientific mindset that is critical to have, not just on an individual level, but at a population level, to have, you know, thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people who are all curious and testing and trying new things and experimenting and exploring and realizing that we can know about the universe, that it's not just mystical. We don't have to take it all on faith. And when it was, you know, kind of as the Reformation led into the Renaissance, led into this new way of thinking, that's when all of the progress really started to cascade forward.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on top of that, if you look at, so a lot of people, including myself, see religion as a detriment to science, and because of that, a detriment to progress. But of course, that's not necessarily the case. It depends on the religious mindset. So if it's a religious mindset that endorses science and even promotes it, then as we can see from the golden age of Islam and from the Calvinists with Henry Ford, etc., it's fine. It works fine. There's no conflict. Well, it might be, but there's no major conflict. But if you look at Ionia, there wasn't a dominant religion, and so it allowed for this fruitful thinking to endorse the scientific method. And then if you look at the golden age of Islam and you look at certain epochs in history, I would suggest that it's not just a correlation between there not being an overarching religious oppression and thinking critically about existential and wonderful questions. And so if there's any lesson to be learned from history, or at least the history of science and of progress, it's that at any time it can, even though it's prevalent and it's a main thing in our lives, it can become all of a sudden within a generation or two not valued. It happened with the Ionians, it happened with Islam, and it can happen today. So the point on educating people and teaching people what the scientific method is and why it matters and how to apply it is not only something that's going to benefit us from falling into pseudoscience and nonsense. It may be the only way or the primary way to stop us from falling back into an age where we don't actually see much progress. May sound bleak, but that is definitely a concern of mine. I don't know if you both share that, but I tend to have a pessimistic view on things of that nature.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I think my main concern is less the idea of like science not being valued so much anymore, and more the worry that people don't understand how to check the reliability or something. Like, there's a lot of talk these days about like fake news and not trusting this and this, but I think while people might be distrustful, they don't quite know how to critically view a source of information. They don't necessarily know how to tell whether it's trustworthy or real or not, and I think that's my concern, that people don't quite understand that process of critical thinking.
Well, hopefully through this podcast we can make a little difference in helping people and encouraging them to help others.
Yeah.
So
I have to say there is a Rachel, really you hit that spot on with I'm kind of the same mindset where I don't think that that we're at a point where everything is going to go back to the dark ages and we're going to be
so just to iterate on there, just so before you continue, I don't think it's gonna happen or even that it's probable, but I really do see it as possible because history shows us that. We just look at the Enlightenment and what happened afterwards. So I just wanted to make that clear. I don't think it's probable.
What I'm more concerned about is that progress will stagnate. So we have access to all this information. We have access to the internet. We have, a supercomputer in our freaking pockets. It's amazing the access of information that we have. And yet we have this wellspring of new sources of information that are tainted. It is a tainted well. It is pseudoscientific nonsense bullshit that is being put forth as, an alternative to, this is the reality. And it's hard to distinguish. You can put two journals side by side and they both are peer reviewed. And one of them is reputable and one of them is not. How do you tell the difference? And I think there was an excellent video put out by Popholer54 where he's talking about that. He's like, this is the era of fake news. How do you tell a reputable journal from a non-reputable one? And you can have two that look very similar, and one is pay to play, where basically they publish anything. And you can put forth an article. Like there was one that a guy sent in an article that said, "Take me off your fucking mailing list." And he just wrote that and he pasted that, and that was in the abstract, and that was in the conclusion, and that was in the methodology, and that was in the title. And he just pasted that, 20 pages of "Take me off your fucking mailing list." And they published it. And they said it would pass peer review.
What?
And it was literally a pay to play journal.
It is.
And so the difference is that there are subscription journals that are reputable, that almost every university library will subscribe to, almost every major faculty department subscribes to and gets access to, because they have a reputation. They are on a subscription level. It is not just, they don't make their money by whoever wants to publish pays them money, and so their incentive is just to publish as many things as possible. Their incentive is on quality, fact-checking. They don't want a single tainted paper to get through, or else other papers might cite that, and then those papers will have tainted information, and then other papers will cite that, and the entire body of knowledge, of scientific knowledge, can become tainted. So there's an excellent tool, I forget the link of the website, but if you Google search for the Master Journals list, and there's a list of these journals that are basically at a certain high standard that are subscribed to by, most majority universities. And then within that, if there's a particular journal and you want to see how effective it is, then you can see I forget the exact name of it, but it's basically their citation. How many times has the average article from this journal been cited elsewhere? And you want it to, the average article to probably be cited at least, 3 or 4 times or something. You don't want something that has zero impact. But you also have to be a little wary of that, because just because it's been cited a lot doesn't mean that it's been cited by a reputable source, or it might have been cited by someone who's disproving it and saying that it's BS. So, a lot of it comes down to just, we can't be lazy. You have to do your research. You have to look at when some news article publishes a thing saying that, hey, look, this article or this new scientific study says that chocolate cures cancer. Okay, well, who's doing the study? Who's reviewing the study? Where was it published? Is it published in a reliable journal, not a pay-to-play one? What did it actually say? Go in and read it. Does it say that it cured cancer? Or does it say that there's a chemical in chocolate that's, been found to reduce a particular instance of something in a particular setting that's completely not what the article is writing about? Because articles try to write sensational headlines. Just getting people to think critically, I think analyze it critically, and to try to detect baloney where, oftentimes it festers.
You hit on such an important point there, and that is that we all do it. If you want to look up something, you have a bias, and if you find it, for example, if you're against evolution and you type in something like, evolution proven false, and you end up coming to the website Evolution News and Science Today, it's very easy to just assume that then and there what's being said is true. It sometimes links to resources, etc. But you have to be not lazy enough and have the time to actually look at the resources and look into the resource. So Evolution News and Science Today, if you go to their about, they have to declare who they are, and they are the Discovery Institute, which is an intelligent design. So it's controlled opposition in that sense. It's abysmal, but it's a product of democracy if you value it. And if you look at the links that they give, they either don't support what they're saying, which is what you've just mentioned there, Thomas, or the links themselves aren't links at all. But it's really difficult because you have to fight against your own cognitive bias, and you have to not be lazy. And that tackles 2 things that we're not good at. One is that we've got cognitive bias, and you've got to be of a certain mindset and have a fear of embarrassment in order to care enough to check whether or not it's not just something that fits your narrative, your beliefs. And the second is you just need to know what you're looking at and how to look at it appropriately, and they're both very difficult things to achieve.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's, if someone actually has something that has scientific merit to it, they're going to want to get it tested. If someone is a pseudoscientific snake oil peddler, they're not going to get their products, reviewed. They're not going to try to get it published in a reputable journal. They're not going to get it FDA approved. They're just going to put forth anecdotes, which are completely useless. Yeah. And they're going to put forth, these weird claims about something, and they might get some doctor who had his medical license revoked to back up a product in order to, reap the benefits. Oftentimes, if they're selling a product, yeah. Or like you have people like Dr. Perlmutter and who's another one that are known for touting pseudoscientific bullshit, and the entire scientific community disapproves of what they're saying for good reason.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a hard battle to win, and it requires a lot of critical thinking, a lot of knowledge, but it's a necessary thing to have in this day and age. I would say it's needed. But there is so much more we could discuss when we're talking about the history of science, and not only about Thales, but expanding on even his predecessor Anaximander, and we can go through Occam's razor and the first meta study, the first computer simulation, the first robot scientist, which is a very interesting thing as well. But in the interest of time, I reckon we should conclude and let the viewers enjoy the rest of their day.
One final thing, for the citation score, basically look for the journal impact factor is what I was.
Nice. Yeah, awesome. And needless to say, we have plenty of links in the description and on our website and wherever wherever we publish and wherever you can find us.
We'll put a link to like the master journals list and anything that we mentioned in this podcast.
For sure. And we just want to basically thank you all for listening. This is the first episode, and so there's going to be teething problems. I hope there wasn't too many. And thank you for your time. And we hope to see you in the next episode, where, if I'm not mistaken, Thomas is going to be talking about the Drake equation and the Fermi paradox, which is...
I already have, actually.
Well, you technically already have. This is true.
We recorded that episode first.
We have. Yep. That's one of the teething problems.
This has been an absolute blast, and now we want you to join in the conversation over on the Here and How Facebook and Twitter pages, or follow us on Pinterest and Instagram if you just want some of the dankest of sciencey memes. If you like one of our particular styles, check out each of our YouTube channels: Rachel Oates, Rationality Rules by Stephen Woodford, and Holy Kool-Aid by me, Thomas Westbrook. To find all of our episodes, show notes, contact information, and more, warp on over to our home base, thehereandhow.com. If you enjoyed this episode and want us to succeed in spreading the love of science, you can help us out by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher. And to all our friends and family listening, thank you for spending this episode with us. We'll be back to explore another exciting big idea next week. Now go create something magnificent.